Okay, I think what I'm going to do is go over the handouts really quick while we wait and see if anybody else filters in live. Again, I know a lot of people were either out of time zones or this is just, you know, a bad timing for them and they're going to watch it back. So I'm going to do a share. Ignore the insanity of my desktop because I'm going to share my desktop this first run around. But I want to just go through. I used to hold them up. People, you can't see them when I'm holding them up. So I'm going to just talk run quick through the handouts. I always share just to one thing, so now I have to fit desktop. Okay. So I'm going to share my desktop. You're going to, if you're, I know some of, hi there, Mr. Chris. A couple of you have taken class with me before, a couple haven't. When I go and share your whole screen, if you're on a computer, you'll probably be forced full screen. You can hit the escape button and get out of full screen if you feel claustrophobic by attacking your whole screen. But I want to go over, before we get switch to the actual lesson part, I did want to go over a couple things. So I'm going to share to desktop. I haven't done this yet, so excuse me if this fails. Okay. And yes, my desktop is insane, but it's actually better. If I'm at the end of doing something, it's covered, so it's definitely been worse. All right, I'm going to find this here. Okay. So you have a couple handouts and I just really want to touch bases with you. The link that I gave you that will take you to a Dropbox so that you can download the handouts. In the week 1 folder, you're going to see or have already seen that there are 2 of each of the ones I'm going to talk about right now. And that's because one of them is a PDF. If you don't want to mess with anything, then simply print the PDF and you're golden, right? Bam, you're done. The reason that I've given you a doc file for 2 of them is so that you can edit them if you so choose. Now, I can't teach you how to use a document program. If you're on a Mac, you will have pages that will automatically come. If you're on Windows, I don't believe you automatically get Word, but you can download Open Office for free, and it has all of the programs like a Microsoft Office, but they're freeware versions and they're really good versions. You can also, if you have a Gmail account, you can use Google Docs to open these and make edits. And the reason that I've done that is because, so take this first one. So this is our, you know, general cheat sheet here, which I love for any of my classes. If I can condense enough information into one sheet, I really like to do that so that while you are practicing or while you're, you know, just keeping it in your rune bag, while you're getting to know the runes, it gives you enough to sort of key in. If you're looking at, you know, some weird one and you're like, what in the earth is that? I can't remember. You can just quickly be able to reference it. However, as we're going to talk about once we get into lecture mode, there are numerous ways to spell, pronounce, even the actual format of the letters can be slightly different. There's a lot of different variations, which we're going to talk about more. And so if you're already somebody who uses runes or has your own way that you write it, pronounce it, define it, you can go in and make changes to this if you want. So what this basic cheat sheet has here is the name. I have settled, so we're going to go over all this. I'm just doing this kind of pre-thing to go over the handouts. But I've settled on sort of common ways in which they are written, and or I also follow a guy on YouTube named Peter. I'm so bad with names. No, Jackson. I was gonna say Peter Jackson. That's the movie director. I think Jackson Crawford. Anyways, he doesn't not anything to do with divination, but he's more of a scholar of old Norse, and so I've kind of used his as well. to be able to, I'm going to open the chat up so I can see it. Yes, he's amazing. He, again, nothing to do with divination. He's a scholastic, more scholar-based, but he, you know, is going at it from that more scholarly base, and so I've used a lot of his pronunciations as well. So again, you're going to find variations of this all over the place. This is what I've decided to land on, but you might land somewhere else. And so this way, if you get the doc format, you can change it. So it's going to give you the name, say for Fehu, the basic, what it means, the word tends to mean, or basic one single keyword about it, which for Fehu would be abundance. How to pronounce it in the best way that I have landed, what the actual word means, such as this means cattle or this means wealth. If there is a Merc staff, so we're going to talk about reversals in a minute, but just in case people do use reversals, a single keyword of what that would be in reverse, it's not always the exact opposite, because sometimes it's actually intensifies so for example, Thurazaz is thorn and misfortune, and when it's reversed, it doesn't change it into being, you know, good fortune. It intensifies the misfortune. So it's not always just an exact reversal. So something to key into the reversal if you use those. And then a really like condensed version of the rune poem, just again to zone us into where we're starting. And then of course you have the actual letter that would be associated with. So that's what you have for your kind of quick cheat, keep it on hand sort of thing. And you can get the document file and be able to change that up if you want to change it up for yourself. Now, the other one that well, this is my version. This is the example of Kelly's crazy brain. So the other file, I thought I opened the one that you guys have. Here it is. Okay. So the other one that is in both PDF and doc format is this one right here. If you've taken my class, especially if you've taken my own class, which would be very similar in terms of this, but because we're looking at systems that are very old and we have very little documentation, especially in their time frames, right? When they would have been first being used. We don't know how they were used. We don't know their exact definitions. Even the oldest of the Old English rune poems are still talking about hundreds of years past when we know they were being used. So we're definitely in the realm with runes, with poems, with geomancy even. Let me mute my phone. These older systems, we are in the realm of reconstruction. We're in the realm of figuring out our best bet, or how they might have been used and how we're going to choose to use them today. So for me personally, in any attempt of tapping into an old system, as I like to get as much of as best I can, how they might have been interpreted as far back as possible, and that is my base, right? That is the starting point, so that then I can add my own experience on top of it. But I like to start with as much the furthest back that we have. So what you have here is the rune itself. You have the Proto-Germanic name, and that's the important thing here, is that there are, and we're going to talk about all of this, I'm just in typical Kelly Babble sense, wanting to go over the handouts, and we're going to talk about this more thoroughly in a minute. But we're the Proto-Germanic version of the name, the sound that it is, because this is an alphabet, right? So these are sounds. So the sound that it makes, the pronunciation, as I said, as I've landed, the basic meaning of the letter, because the letter has a basic meaning, such as Uruz is wild ox. That's what it means. And then the three poems. And there are more, there are 4 poems, and then there's fragments of things that we actually have. But the oldest that we have is the Old English rune poem. So that is here with how it was written out. Then the Norwegian and the Icelandic are often very close in terms of their meanings, but I put there's a little, sometimes a little variation. So the Norwegian and the Icelandic rune poems, because that gives meanings. And then a space for you to put your own meanings in, because none of these things are static. You know, systems, yes, and I am the first person that says, have your base in the traditions as much as possible. Know your history as much as possible. Get a foundation of the traditions as much as possible. But it doesn't stay static back in 150 CE in what is now Norway. It didn't just stay static there and it exists in this little bubble here. So sorry. If we are going to use these systems, they have to stay alive, and we have to infuse them with Isabel Louise. Come here. Come here. Come on. She is not like my landlord, and he is like cleaning up around the apartment, and she doesn't like him. I would listen to him. Isabel, come on. I'm gonna have to grab her in a minute. Anyways, so we need to develop our own meanings with using them. But I want to suggest, because there is, oh my goodness. Stop. Come on. Oh, this chunky monkey. This chunky monkey. Come down here with Mama. Oh, sit down here. Be quiet. There you go. Okay, sorry. It's one of the downsides of having a cute dog. I know, she's adorable. Okay, so my point is, one of the things, so this is a stripped down version of mine. So I'm going to bring this down. So what I would suggest, you can just print it out and start to use it to write sort of your meanings. But I do think that part of your homework for this week, I shouldn't have closed that. Part of your homework for this week is to kind of set aside what you already may know about runes, how you might have seen it in particular books and these types of things. Sort of set that aside for a minute and take some time with these 3 pages, looking at the physically looking at what the rune looks like, thinking about the sound that the rune makes, thinking about what the rune itself means, the actual meaning of the word, and then these rune poems that we do have access to, because this is the oldest information that we have regarding how they might have been interpreted. And then coming up with sort of an idea, a couple keywords for yourself. When you look at all that stuff together, what does that say to you as what that particular rune might mean? Again, try to set aside books. And books are wonderful, and we're going to talk about books. But for this week, try to just go back to the rune poems, go back to the meanings, go back to the sounds of the words, and the sound of the letter, and come up with a couple keywords for yourself of where this might start to build your associations with the rune. So that's the purpose of that. But the reason that I gave it to you in doc format is this is where I started from. So I need to add more to this, but it wouldn't fit on the thing, but I have a couple of the books to add. So this is where I started, basically up to here is what you have, right? Now, I have my keywords that are right here. I have sort of a definition here. And then I have a couple books that I have on runes that I particularly might like or have found something interesting from. And I've gone through the books that I have that I wanted to add into this list and pulled some keywords from different books. Now, sometimes you'll see, like, for example, Wunyo, you'll see pretty much being joy and happiness and these types of things. So sometimes you'll have runes that they stay pretty much the same across all the sources. Sometimes you'll find ones that really have differences that come up, and it can kind of make you think about that particular rune in a different way. And you may end up saying, you know, not so much, it doesn't resonate with me, but at least you've kind of, you know, processed through all of this to kind of come up with how you might read the runes. So you can just go in with the file that you have and add extra columns for books that you might have, resources that you might have that you want to add in, and start to build this a real solid understanding around each one of the runes. So that's why those two things are in two different formats that are there. Let me close that one. And then you have this in two different formats in case you want to tweak that. And then you have your actual handouts that are here. This one's pretty light. You're going to have a lot more next week. I did want to point out here, this last part, I do think that there is no way that a 4-week class is a condensed class no matter what you're teaching. And there's no way in a 4-week class that I can teach you Norse mythology. This is not a Norse mythology class, and it's impossible to do so. I do think that everybody who is interested in working with runes should have a copy of the Poetic Edda. Both of them. I particularly love the Poetic Edda. This is my current favorite translation, which is by the Jackson Crawford that I mentioned. He translated it. I do really love this translation. I love he has one in the back where he's made it the cowboy Havamal. So he's rewritten Odin, I think it's Odin's Havamal, into like a cowboy, you know, if it was somebody in Colorado cowboy that would be writing it, which is cool because it really shows you have to have a really strong understanding of a poem or something like that to be able to pull off something, and that's cool. But anyways, love this translation. So having something like this is important to really sink into the time frames and things of that nature. So I do highly recommend something like that. Okay, so those are the handouts. So I'm going to stop this particular share. There we go. Hello, Mr. Chris. I'm gonna sneeze. Hello, Miss Therese. I see. I feel like I'm gonna sneeze. It is full on fall season, which I love, but boy, does it kill my allergies. Okay, so I'm going to close some of this stuff because we're going to have a mess started here. Okay. So a couple things, and then I'm going to shift over to the actual slides, and then we'll get a little less formal once we switch out of that. Some people are going to be watching back, so I do try to stay on point at the beginning part so that they can see things that way. I want to mention a couple things. I briefly talked about it here, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it in the slides. In terms of rune names and rune spellings and even the ways in which the runes look, I see a lot on message boards, even YouTube videos and things like that, where people will be like, oh, this person got it entirely wrong. They're saying it's you know, this instead of this over here, and it's not spelled that way. Spelling is something that has a relatively small window of consistency, even in the English language. So as a lit major, I did a lot of work with medieval, Old English. You could have one single page and have the same word be written in 3 or 4 different spelling variations. So spelling is not something that was concrete. And, you know, we're much more picky about the idea of this is a word and it's spelled this way and no other way now than we ever were in a very not that long ago in history. So we also have to remember that, and we're going to talk again a little bit more about this, but we're mostly dealing with the Elder Futhark in this class. We're going to talk about some of the variations, but we're mostly working with the Elder Futhark. That is an alphabet for Proto-Germanic. So this is I'm not a linguist, but this is more like a seed alphabet that then branches out to Old Norse, Old English, Icelandic, Germanic. I think it was High Germanic that would have gone first. Again, I'm not a linguist, but it branched out into numerous languages and other forms of the runes because this is an alphabet. So you're going to have variations on what the runes look like, variations on what people call them, depending on what source they're using, variations on spelling, all kinds of things of that nature. So the only thing that you could say somebody was wrong about is if they're just kind of pulling something out of their hat and saying, you know, this is gobbledygook and just randomly calling it something, you're going to see variations. My recommendation with old systems in which there are variations in place is to take the time, hopefully by the end of the class, you can at least, if you're newer to runes and don't already have that kind of locked down for yourself, figure out where you're landing and just apply that consistently. Consistency is far more important in reading, you know, figuring out what are your base meanings, what are you calling it, and just applying that in a consistent way, then kind of jumping all over the place depending on each source. You see this mostly if you're working with decks because they're going to call it different things depending on what that particular person, the source that they're pulling it from. And so you will see differences. But don't stress about that. And generally it's not because somebody is out and out wrong. It's just because they pulled from a different source. Now, the other problem with older systems is that there was for lack of a better term, a new age movement that occurred in which a lot of these old systems were kind of revitalized, and which is great. They were pulled back into people thinking about them and using them for divination. But a lot of the way that they would write about these, and I can't remember the guy's name, I think it's his last name is Bloom. He's responsible for the blank rune or the weird rune. It's an alphabet. There wasn't a blank letter. Like it was an alphabet used to write words. You don't write words and have a blank unless it's a space. So that was something that was added in the 80s by pretty much, I Ralph, I was going to say Richard, Ralph Bloom. I've got his book somewhere. He also changed the order of the runes to go in a different order. He added this in, but the problem is, which is fine. I think that we can all take something and make it into our own, but they were often written as if this is truth, right? This is the way the runes are. And then over time, now we have people referencing books that were just people's interpretations of it as if that was truth and as if that's the historical context of it. So I appreciate, there's one author, and again, I'm going to go over books in a second, but there's a couple authors that I have that will say where this is what it is historically, and this is my experience with it, which is great. I love to read people's experiences with it because I might gain something from that, but I want to know what is historical versus what is somebody else's experience. And that wasn't always happening in the 70s and the 80s. And so we get a perpetuation of misinformation that occurs. And in runes, I think the most obvious one is the idea of the blank rune. Now, does this mean that you can't use a blank rune? Of course not. My very first set had a blank rune in it. It came with a piece, it was in the mid 90s, and it was a set of stone runes. It had a blank one. It came with a little piece of paper with cool little, Celtic knotwork around it, and it had some keywords for each of them, and it had a blank rune in it. That's all that I had to do with it. And I used the blank rune for a long time. I used it as weird because that is a concept that I worked with a lot. So, in the Jarvis extension, the XLX, that is I would say numbers. Mac is numbers. I'm blanking on Excel. So that would be opened with Excel or numbers, or I don't know what it's called in the free version. But if you use Google Docs, it would be a numbers document. It's a spreadsheet is what that is. So yeah, okay, thanks for asking that, because somebody else will be thinking the same thing. So, okay, so my point is you can still use a blank. Some people have used runes forever and they've used a blank rune. If you have a blank rune and you love using a blank rune, a lot of sets still come with a blank rune. I have a beautiful set of wood ones here. Yeah, this one has a blank rune. So a lot of the sets that you get today will have a blank rune because some people use them, some people don't use them, and it's just become part of sort of the lore of runes, even though it was an additional thing. So I don't use it. Currently, I don't use them, but if you want to use it, use it. Have your meaning, figure out what that's going to be, apply that consistently, and you're good to go. But just be aware that it's a modern addition that has been added on. In terms of reversal, so that's the other thing that people ask a lot. Again, this was an alphabet, so people weren't writing letters upside down. They were writing them the correct, the way that they're written. Although you can get some, I'll show you some examples of it in a minute. They would write them backwards. They did do, I believe a lot of it was probably aesthetic, that they would, because they were carving these on swords and things of that nature. And there was a lot of play of, are they writing in the direction right to left, or are they writing from left to right? That could really vary a lot. These things were not as solidified as we have them today. But for the most part, they were written right side up. Some of the runes, as you'll notice if you look at the cheat sheet one, which I should have kept up, there will be some in the position of reversals that say the word none in them. And that's because if you reverse that rune, it's going to look the same. So if you reverse Gabo, which is just an X, you reverse it, it's still an X. Nothing has changed. And so those don't have reversals to them. We'll talk a little bit more in casting how you can get at shadow aspects in there's other ways you can do it other than just reversals. If you're casting, you're very rarely going to have a rune show up upright or straight upside down. You're casting them, they're going to be all in different directions that they're going to be going in. So I don't personally use reversals of the rune itself because for me, they weren't intended to be reversed. Not all of them can be reversed. And so I don't use that, but just as with tarot or any other system, we should always be looking at the light and shadow of a figure that shows up, regardless of which way it ends up. Also, when you cast, sometimes the runes are going to be face down, literally where you're not seeing it. That's often more how I look at something that is not fully activated, not fully in place, or maybe in shadow more so than the direction. But just like with tarot, just like with anything, and with the question of reversal comes up, you have to figure out what resonates with you. Try both ways. See what works for you, what doesn't work with you in terms of your experiential knowledge. Again, 4 weeks, even as much and fast as I talk, you're only going to get so much in 4 weeks. The only way that you're going to fall into runes and having a relationship with runes is putting them on the table and working with them. And you're going to start to say, oh, this idea of reversals, this really means something to me. This really resonates with me. This is what happens in an experience when I'm casting a reading and that one comes up. Over time, you start to see what's going to work for you. Now, book-wise, when you get runes, some do talk about reversals and some do not. It depends. Same thing with tarot. They're often called merc staves. In the reversed form is often noted as merc staves or something similar to that. So you'll get some of variations even in the books that you find. So I wanted to talk about that with runes. I like the blank rune for the void. I have heard that, yeah, the void is an interesting one to use as well. It could be anything, right? What do you feel like there's an energy that you want to place in? It could be the web for some people, which is what weird for me is attaches to the idea of the web. So it's, again, you can add extra ones. You will be surprised. You can find runes, like if you look, one of the best books, and we're going to talk about books here. I'm going to have to grab my iPad. I should have had it. But one of the books I really recommend, a student of mine, Michelle, actually recommended this to me, and I love this little book. It's called The Rudiments of Rune Lore, and it's by Stephen Pollington. And I will, in the email that I send with the final video link, I'll put a list of the books that we talk about today. This little book is fantastic because it does have some degree of, it's from the perspective of somebody who does read runes for divination. So it's not completely scholastic, but it has, in a short space, a lot of the variations that you can find in runes. It has the 4 rune poems in a short space. It also has 7 of the Old English verses, because there's little chunks of verses that we do have in Old English about runes. And so there are copies of them both in the Old English and a translated version of it. Some runic finds that out of normal places that they found, that they've added in. And so it's really, for a teeny tiny book, and you can get this on Amazon, it has just a lot of concise information about all of the variations. It's one of the few that you can find that talk more in depth about the Northumbrian runes, which is the set I'm currently working with is a Northumbrian set. And I'll show you a great book on that on my Kindle, but it's one of the few that has information about that, because most of the time in terms of divination, you're seeing a lot of text about the elder Futhark, or the oldest one, which is what we're going to be focusing on. So that's a great one. I guess we'll just go through books real quick here. I always recommend Nordic Runes by Paul Riis-Mountfort. And probably none of these books will I say they write exactly everything that I agree with about a runes, because what's the point? We all have differing opinions, but it's a solid book. His book on Oghams is the same way. It's a solid book. It gives you, what I like is that he gives you some of the background myths that might be associated with the runes, which is really helpful. He gives you, what it looks like, obviously. He gives you how it would be described, or what it would be called. He gives you variations, which is nice. So you can see those different variations that you might see across it, what it sounds like. He gives the Old English rune poem, which is again the oldest one, but I think earlier on he gives I think you have access in this book to all, at least 3 of I think the Norwegian, the Icelandic, and the Old English here. And then he gives you a visualization, which can be helpful for new people, to how could you look at this and actually see something to help, remember what is this random letter and what does it mean. And then he gives you obviously the meaning. He has a section on myths and legends. And I really like that, because you start to tie into sort of the myths and things that came around with it. So this to me is a solid choice if you want one book on runes. I'm going to mention this, even though this is a controversial one. So this is a sort of a regrouping, I think, of several old books by Edred Thorson, which is a renaming of, I don't know what his real name, I can't remember his real name. But this is called The Big Book of Runes and Rune Magic. I like this book. I think the resources in here are fantastic. Understanding that this is from one person's perspective. The problem currently is that this author is currently now, his belief system seems to lean more towards the white supremacist things that you can get with, unfortunately, runes can get superseded into some of these Odinism that is a very ethnocentric supremacist mindset. They kind of use this ideology of runic lore in a negative sense. This is common. It is not what, but the interesting thing is he wrote this in, I would say, a lot of this stuff was written in the 70s and 80s. And he writes in this book how the history of runes, the theology surrounding the time period is completely anathema to the concepts of Nazism or the Nazi Socialist Party, any of those things. He writes in here how they don't coexist. But in modern times, he is has shifted in that direction. So a lot of people, of course, are reluctant to purchase the books because obviously they're supporting somebody who is in that movement. I did not know this when I got the book, but I had a lot of people point this out to me. But I'm still going to bring it up because a lot of people either have this or they have the older versions in which this came from, and it's a really good resource. It's really well done. As I said, he literally puts in here how, because the Nazis used runes in some of their things, there was a resurgence of this sort of Nordic past, and so because the Nazis also used Buddhist symbols, so just because the Nazis or the white supremacists or somebody like that takes from, blindly pulls from a system and uses it, does not taint the system. Those are individuals. Runes are tools, and how people use them can be, you know, you can take a pen and write with it, or you can poke somebody in the eye with it. You know, we use tools in sometimes negative formats, and that doesn't make runes the tool. You know, people say this, you know, that runes, we shouldn't be using runes because they're associated with, you know, white supremacy and these types of things. That's ridiculous. You know, runes were used, an alphabet that was used way back, and some people have incorporated this into negative context. But I do find this book to be really have a lot of interesting information in it. Again, I had purchased it and read it before I had known anything about that. So yeah, so that's that. You'll see when you search for runes, you'll see several different books by this Edred Thorson, because he did write a lot about the runes in the past. So I did want to at least bring that up. One of the books I'm really excited about currently is called The Lost Teaching of the Runes. This just came out. It is by Ingrid Kincaid, who I had heard of. Just if you're kind of interested in runes, you will sometimes bump into her because she's kind of known as the Rune Woman, and she's worked a long time with runes. What I love about this book is this is literally, now she does give you base understandings of the runes, but this is one person's experience with runes. Like she did, you know, journey work, meditation work on runes, and has her own experiences. And she writes in this amazing poetic prose about all of these things. But I have read through, you know, in the back, she does have sort of a poem, and then she has a base meaning, and the meanings are all the ones that, you know, you can see the traditional meaning is there. But I think this is a really good example of how the conversation around runes doesn't need to stop in, you know, 100 CE or whenever that is, or even 1200s when some of the rune poems, that if we're going to use these in a modern sense, we as individuals, as people who use runes, have to be growing and having a conversation with runes, and coming to terms with our own meanings and what that means for me in where the place that I'm standing in 2019. That is just as valid as you know, the old English rune poem from the 1200s. But what I love is that she really encourages, get a bunch of rune books, see what other people are saying, and then figure out from yourself. You know, take this, take that, and then that amalgamation becomes a very personal way of reading for you, that nobody's going to be the exact same. So I'm really enjoying this this particular book. I do want to grab my iPad really quick because there's two other books I want to mention. I should have had it up here. One of them is really fantastic for the, you know, a lot of times we get books on runes or oghams and we kind of skip to the meaning, you know, to the section that has all the runes there. But this guy Nigel Pennick wrote a book called Runic Lore and Legend. I'm gonna see if I can get the cover up here. Why? Love technology until it's not helping us. Let's see, cover. Okay. So it looks like this. You can get it on Amazon, obviously in Kindle form or regular. I was impatient when I read the back of this and got it in Kindle. I don't actually like my reference books on Kindle. It's really hard to kind of go back. If it's just something I'm reading, I don't care, but reference books, I'm not as thrilled about. Two things about this. This does focus on the Northumbrian runes, and there are very few books that do so. So I really like that. But his first couple chapters, to me, is worth the whole book for, because he really talks about, especially the Northumbrian runes took place in a very specific area, but it actually was a confluence of Celtic, Norse, I can't remember. He had, I think there's like 4 different cultures that really coalesced in this one small area. And so the Northumbrian runes are really interesting because they have a lot of Celtic influence with Owens, and they are influenced by a lot of different things that shift them a little bit over from what we were thinking about with just the Norse traditions of the Elder Futhark. And so but the way that he talks about how much land, the physical aspects of the land that something comes out of, the cultures that how much that forms it's really interesting. Like, it's so, I'm one of those people that skips to the meat of something in a reference book, and this one, the joy here is the first couple chapters where he's really, and it makes you think about your own self and the land that you're on, what your seasons look like, what does your world look like, and how that can influence the way that you interpret the different runes and what they might mean to you, and how taking the time to know your own weather patterns and your own physical characteristics and what are the trees around you, all of that stuff comes into play, and how we can really interpret these types of things. So that's a beautiful, beautiful book that I am thrilled with. And again, if you have any interest in the Northumbrian runes, he has another book called Beyond the North. That's a different author. The guy that wrote his prologue wrote a book called Beyond the North Wind that is, I haven't finished reading, but it's amazing. The other one, the last one that I'm going to say is, this is a fantastic resource because what she does, I'm going to try to get the cover up. This is called Taking Up the Runes, and it's by Diana Paxson. What I like about this is much more of a spiritual, I would say, is it this one? She goes through in sets of 2s, and she has a lot of rituals and things like that you might be able to do with runes. So she goes beyond just like divination and in a much more ritualistic sense. But what I really like about her book is that she references kind of nutshells all of the sort of main leading minds about runes. So in one book, in her sections, you get at least a semi idea of the different ways in which scholars, main scholars, interpret each one of the runes. So it's a great way to have sort of a condensation of what modern people writing about runes are, how they're interpreting that. And so it's great to see in one like paragraph of some variations of ways in which different people might interpret that particular rune. So that to me is the benefit of that particular book, is because you do get that instead of having to buy, which, if you love runes, then you might want to collect all those books. But if you're just trying to get a feel for things, you got it in one condensed form. And I think that's really helpful. So those are the main, now I've had runes since the 90s. I've read, who knows what I've read. I've read a ton of stuff back when there were news groups in the back of the beyond of the internet. I had tons of, printed out information and things like that. But those are the books that I have. In terms of referencing, I mostly, I guess I don't as much anymore. I use this, I love this book a lot. And I probably reference these 2 the most. just as if you just want 2 books that just kind of give you your key core of what you need. And again, the joy of this one is that he does reference a lot of the folklore that not all of them, they'll say little snippets where he gives more of the actual tales versus just kind of saying this is kind of associated with XYZ story, which you may or may not know or know where to find. They're more put in here in a little bit more depth, and that's why I really like that one, because I enjoy myths and folklore and things like that. So I probably reference these the most, those 2, if you just wanted to tie that down to 2. Okay, so that's books. Guidebooks, and we're not going to talk a lot about decks. I don't actually have very many rune decks. I cast runes. I'm really not somebody who uses runic decks. I do think that the beauty of runes is in the casting, and when you remove that aspect, it becomes something a little bit different. It doesn't mean that it's bad. It doesn't mean that it's not useful, but it's different when you pull something and lay it out neatly versus cast and let that organically happen. Actually, I think I only have 2 decks. I have the Cosmic Whisper deck because my best friend got it for me for my birthday, and I have enjoyed it because I use it if I'm gonna pull 3. This is like layer upon, I gotta do a walkthrough. I did one and I lost the whole entire video footage, which when you make videos as long as mine, that's really frustrating. Oh, you have it too. Chris has it. I do love these so much. They feel like wood chips. They're actually paper that's layered upon layer of paper, but they're like wood chips. They're super, super thick. And I use these when I'm pulling 3, because I will mostly cast 9. That's my general format. I do full castings of runes, but for the most part, for OMs, runes, my own journey tokens, I tend to cast 9. That's just me. But if I'm pulling 3, I've been using these and absolutely love them. The guidebook is hit and miss. It's a good to have, but it couldn't be the only, in my opinion, it can't be the only thing any source you had. And that's pretty much how I feel about most decks. Most deck guidebooks, and I know there's a lot of rune decks out there, I just don't have them. I have one other rune deck, which is the creator, the artist of the Heindel Tarot it's an out of print rune deck, but he did some weird variations with it, so I don't use it, but I have it. That's it. That's all I have, because I cast runes. I don't. But this, I adore this deck. I have no clue how expensive it was because I didn't purchase it, and I think it's a very small run. I think there were just 5, because they hand layer those. Like, it's crazy how they put these together is by hand layering it, so it's just a lot of work. But for the most part, I'm a caster, and we're going to be talking about casting. So there, in terms of decks, mostly I've seen complaints about, again, the different spellings. It's probably not a false spelling. It's just they've chosen one particular source. And then in terms of the guidebooks, they tend to be the most surface level, just kind of giving your basics. And you probably would want to have a separate book to really dive into runes. Just want to unbox it. They're like tiles. They're really fantastic. I was not going to get them just because I don't use cards for runes, but it was a birthday present, and I have to say I'm really glad I have them, because I do, like, for myself, I do a lot of cauldron. For me, it's 3 cauldrons, like Chris probably knows from OM class, but that's something that I do a lot. And so when I'm pulling 3, I use that, but when I'm casting, you gotta toss the runes, you gotta throw them. Okay, so that was a lot of babble. I will put a list of the books that I talked about in the email so that you have them. All of the books that I mentioned are available today. I don't think any of these are not available, because I've repurchased some of these recently. And a lot of them are available on the Kindle. Just making sure I don't have anything else sitting around here. I think that's it. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm so bad. just in terms of general, if you've not taken a class with me, classes are generally 2 to 3 hours long. If you have to leave, just leave, no harm, no foul. They will be put up, people can watch them back in smaller pieces. I try to condense a lot in 4 classes, and that means a lot of talking. So, okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and quickly, some people do. Some of them get to, like next week's is probably gonna be a bit longer because we're gonna be going through the runes and that takes time, but I just have given up trying to give people times. They're at least 2 hours. Everything after that is questionable. Okay, let me open this up real quick. So I don't want to go to, again, you are going to get put full screen if you are on. If you are on a computer. I don't know what it's probably always going to be full screen on a tablet or something. Okay, let's go this way. Make my face a little bit smaller. People don't need to see my face that big. So a lot of this I've kind of hit on already, but I do want to just go through some things here. And we'll skip over what I've already said as much as possible. I'm trying to see where to stick my face so it's not in the way of things. There we go. So here's some basic things. Again, we have people taking the class that have used runes for a long time, and we have people who are taking the class who have never done anything with runes. And so I do try to take all my classes at least as if you hadn't had any experience with runes. And so for some, this will be repeat. So the runes, as I said, I'm not gonna too much over repeat, but it is a alphabet that was used to write Proto or early Germanic languages. And this was before the Roman alphabet. Now, one of the things that's interesting, and I'll show you something if I'm going to put this out so I don't forget to do so. One of the things that is interesting is that while the Icelandic, if you look at an Icelandic rune set, they actually look quite a bit different. The Icelandic language was one of the it did come from the Proto-Germanic, and they did use runes, but they more quickly than Old German, Old Norse, and Old English, Old Icelandic more quickly, to speak sometime, they more quickly started using the Roman alphabet than these other three. And so you see a shift over more quickly in Icelandic to the Roman alphabet, but they actually were the ones that kept the tradition of the runic use, and especially even in terms of casting and magic work and things of that nature, was something that was preserved really well in Iceland. And so we could have, thanks to the preservation in Iceland, a lot of the sources that we have about runes are because of that. Even though their runes shifted faster as well, there are several of them that look quite different than what I've ever seen in other types of runes. And they didn't use it as an alphabet as long as, again, the Germanic, Old English, Old Norse, Old German used it as an actual alphabet much longer. So that's kind of interesting there. But we're talking about alphabets, just like alphabet is alpha, beta, right? The word Futhark is just the beginning letters of the alphabet. And you can see it right here. I don't know if I need to open up the chat. If somebody can say, I ask this every time, but they've changed, there we go. They have changed Zoom yet again. I'm pretty sure you can see my mouse pointer. If somebody can say in chat whether that's the case, that would be really helpful to me. But I think that yes, you can. Okay, thank you. So if you look at these first letters here, this is where you're getting the F and the U. This is TH. And the ARK or K sound with Kenas or Kauna, depending on how you say it. So the word Futhark for the elder Futhark, younger Futhark, as just the beginning of the alphabets. And this is common practice in naming alphabets by their beginning letters. So that's where you get that term. As I said, we're mostly going to be looking at the elder Futhark, which is the oldest one. This is what they would have used before things started to branch out. And so what happens is, again, we're talking about an alphabet for languages here. And so as the alphabets, or as the languages morphed out, right? So if you have that seed language, as let's say it goes to Old English, there were different sounds that were needed, and so letters were added on. The younger Futhark actually reduced letters, so we had a reduction of the number of letters, and then so we have these splitting off into different languages, and the reasons why we see different letters, more or less changes that happen, is because it's an alphabet and they needed different sounds based on that particular language. And so you'll see variations. The elder Futhark, I think, is most often used in divination because it is the oldest one, and it's that proto where things split off from there. So you'll see most of the time, unless if you're just purchasing a rune set, you know, a rune set on stones, you're mostly going to see a 24 set or a 25 set. If it's a 25 set, it's just adding that extra blank rune on there. If it doesn't say what kind of rune set it is, it's most likely an Elder Futhark rune set. Now, these have been, in the 24 set, they are often split into sort of 3 suits. I have done some research trying to figure out exactly when and where that came from. I don't know. I mean, obviously, we only have documentation of manuscripts. I want to say that the Old English is 1200. We're going to talk about that in a minute. So we're still talking about literally hundreds of years after when these were originally being used. So my thought process is these were something that were added much later, even possibly to the modern. You see them talked about in most books about runes, but I haven't seen anything past sort of the modern books people talking about it. So I'm not sure about that, but you will see in most books that they're broken into Freya's 8, Hagel's 8, and Tyr's or Tiwa's, generally Tyr's 8. And I have mixed feelings about that. I don't necessarily think that the first alphabet or the first 8 have to do with nurture. There's a lot of different things going on in the first 8. I think they're all to do with introspection. So this to me is sort of a loose fitting, but most books that you get, and certainly I'm going to guess decks, even though again I don't have very many decks. This deck guidebook does talk about the splitting them into the 8s as well, but I do think that that's a bit of a modern addition. But I don't take that with a grain of salt because I haven't been able to find anything concrete about it. So this is an example of a stone that has the carvings of the runes on them. You'll often, this is very similar to Oghams, you'll often have very straight lines in these older alphabets because they were carved onto things like, you know, metal and stone and wood, and it's just easier to carve in straighter lines. Now these do have some nice curves that are going on. A lot of times you'll see more straight lines on them because of what they're being carved on. But one of the things that I did point out is that you will see either things that are going from left to right. You'll also see going just all from right to left. You'll also see where it snakes around, where it's being written here, and then it comes this way, and then it goes this way, and it kind of makes a snaky thing. That didn't seem to be something that was, again, formalized, that we only write this to this. Must not have been formalized until much later, because you'll definitely see variations that way. And so, So that's interesting. I mean, there's just so many variations that are involved here. Now, we're going to talk a little bit more about bind runes in the last class. This is definitely something that is used more in a magical sense, in terms of combining runes together to create other runes. Now, you will see certain things called bind runes that aren't actually bind runes. Actually, some of the real popular images that you'll see aren't actually bind runes. They're actually Old Icelandic magic symbols that they look like they are the possible combinations of runes, but it's actually very specific symbols that were used in some magic texts in Old Iceland. But an actual bind rune is a combination of runes. So for the example that's shown down here, if you have Issa or ice here and this here, and you add Engaz here over the top of it, you get this combination of the two. And this is again used for setting intentions, doing magic where you're wanting to take that. You could actually also start with a bind rune and then pull them apart just in terms of magic usage. And so we are going to talk about those, but we're going to talk about those more in the last class versus now. But I did want to mention it because people often ask what a bind rune is. And it is just a combination to create a sigil, to create a magic working. And the idea of using runes as magic, despite what even wonderful people like Jackson Crawford might say, we do actually have evidence of oghams and runes being used as magic for healing work, for let me see if I have it here, bookmark. We'll talk about it more, but yeah, so I have this one marked. So in the Havamal, which is in the Poetic Edda, it talks about some spells. I think these are spells from Odin. Yeah, so these are some spells that you might use. And one of them says, I know a 6th spell. If a man carves a curse against me and runes on the root of a tree, I call this spell down upon that man, and his curse harms him instead of me. There's also another one where if you find, yeah, here it is. I know a 12th spell. If I see hanging from a tree a dead man's corpse, I carve some runes and paint them, and then that corpse will walk and speak to me. So we do, in the oldest text that we do have evidence that the use of runes in magic work was just part and parcel to it. You'll see things about unbinding spells, like if you find yourself in a position which you are tied up, being able to use particular runes to help to get yourself loose from being tied up and things of that nature. So the use of runes has, in magic, does have a very old tradition to that. And a lot of that does work with workings with bind runes. So we have that aspect. I'm sorry, for people watching back, I apologize that I'm moving my face around so much, but I'm trying to make it so you can see everything. This is just a good map kind of showing, because I think we have a mistaken a mistaken idea of runes as being Norse, right? And only Norse. It's like this very specific place in the Norse culture where those might be. And that's it. And they're actually, again, because we have to remember that Old German, Old English, Old Norse, Old Icelandic, these were used, this spread out, and it was comes from this seed language. It actually has, I think, a much wider variation. Of course, we're still talking about this area of Europe, but it has, I think, a much wider base than some people are aware of. And this particular map is showing the Germanic languages and where they would be at from around 900 CE. So languages have shifted and changed from when the Elder Futhark was being used much earlier than that. Because one of the other questions that I get a lot is, can I use runes, right? I'm not Norse, can I use runes? Again, not only the Norse people used runes, as we say here, there's two questions that are there. I talked a little bit about this, I think, in my live chat yesterday, but there's two questions built into that question. There's a question that I get very often, like, is it disrespectful for me to use runes if I'm not, you know, if I'm not have Viking heritage or something like that? And then the other question is who actually did use these? Is far more wider. If you have any English heritage, if you have any Celtic heritage, if you have any Swedish heritage, German heritage, Norse heritage, it's much wider, I think, than most people realize that it is. So number one, you probably do have some sort of heritage that takes you to there. But even if you don't, if we only use systems, and this is a valid choice, like somebody's choice might be to only use a system that is part of their their genetic ancestral past. There's a lot of things that we wouldn't use, right? Technically, tarot would only be used by people of Italian and French descent in order to use that, from where that came. And of course, nobody really questions about whether or not we should be using tarot or not. I think everybody's pretty well conceded that everybody can use tarot, and that came from a very specific time in Roman Catholic Italy and France. Now, of course, playing card divination, you could go, you know, into more of the Eastern countries and things as well. But my point is that I personally don't think that your genetic heritage determines what system that you can use. Now, I do believe that we should be respectful about the systems that we're using. Again, I think that we should have an idea of where they came from, of when they came from, have as much knowledge as we can about the system that we're using, and approach those systems with respect. But we, I think, have a misunderstanding in the sort of spiritual or esoteric community that things in the past were so static, that just this one culture in this one little bubble here used XYZ or believed XYZ. The migration and movement of cultures, ethnicities, family groupings was always a factor, right? We had people moving from food, famine, people being stolen from, you know, groups of people being captured and brought over here, and their ideas being brought into the others. If you watch the trail of mythologies and stories, they're all intertwined and retellings and shiftings. They go into one culture and they shift into another, and they shift form based on the time and the place and the people that are there. The interchange and movement of ideas and information has been happening as long as there have been people walking around on the planet. And so that doesn't need to stop now, where all of a sudden we break everything off into these little tiny bubbles and say, well, if you're not Norse, you can't do this, or if you're not Irish, you can't do this. That's in my mindset, that's a very modern construct. So again, respectful use, taking the time to understand where something comes from, because that helps you to understand how it was interpreted. Approaching these things with respect. Yes, anybody can use runes, regardless of what your blood ancestry is. Now, I also believe in reincarnation, so that starts to open everything wide. Who knows the cultures, right, that we have experienced and been in the past. So we're human beings in a human world, and divination systems are expressions of humanness, of being human and wanting to ask questions of the greater world and the greater universe around us. And that is a human thing, not a cultural thing. But again, with respect, everything with a heavy dose of respect and a heavy dose of due diligence is, in my opinion, something that we should be wanting to have spread around and not kept insular. Again, we're going to leave that there. But that question gets asked a lot, is can I use it if I'm not Norse? It's like, yes, you can, number one. And number two, it wasn't just the Norse that were using runes. Okay, so, sorry, I'm moving stuff around here. The first inscription date, so in terms of historical, because again, this stuff's important to me, the first confirmed inscription date that we have using the Elder Futhark is 160 CE. Now, as with anything, just because this is what we have left, this is it's a comb. Here's an image of over here, and it's a physical thing that could survive that long, right? Does not mean that the use of runes started in 160, right? We know it was being used, and that means there are probably a lot of pieces of leather, even wood. These types of things are going to break down, and we're not going to have them. This comb wasn't the first magical thing that had runes written on them. It was being used well before then. So we're talking about an extremely old system of writing. And again, but this is the first one that we have, and this was from 160. They think that it's either a name or it simply said hair, which is very possible. Some of the things that they do find are often names like, you know, so-and-so owned this, like on a sword or things like that. There are definitely a lot of names there. A lot of uses that we're aware of that were probably used would have been on the center poles of houses. They certainly, we know there was a tradition of carving runes in there. Same thing with oghams. Those are similar histories, similar time frames. They would be placed on things for like to help with childbirth or things of that nature being used that we can find. I know the oldest ogham is an amber bead, and it was something for teething for babies and I think childbirth. So we know, and even the oldest pieces that we have, we know that these were being used not just as a straight up alphabet, but also with the understanding that there was inherent power within them. And this is something that you'll see in I Ching, in the hexagrams being considered actual, the trigrams and hexagrams are actual pieces of energy that you are working with, similar to Hebrew, the Hebrew language, the letters. I don't know what, I'm so sorry. I think it's my iPad. You try to turn everything off and things still make noises. Let's put that over here. It's like very muted sounded, but I kept hearing something. So yeah, I just lost my train of thought. I'm sure I was babbling. We're going to go back here. So anyways, we do know that the Elder Futhark was used till about the 700s as an alphabet. And then we really start to see that things have branched out. The younger Futhark goes down to 16. So it goes from 24 to 16, which makes it very much more difficult. Most of the time, if you go on sort of these sites that they will convert your name, they will almost do a conversion of your name into Old English or Old Norse first and then convert it into runes, because it has to do with the sounds. It can be a little bit more difficult to use. But the medieval runes, it gets expanded. I think the biggest one, it can be definitely, I want to say 38. I should have written that down. But there's variations that are going. In the Anglo-Saxon or the Anglo-Frisian or the Old English alphabet was well into the sometimes up to 35, 36, and I want to say up to 38. So you're going to see variations, making it easier to write because you had the different sounds. And you can see that here in this chart right here, where this is the Elder Futhark at 24. You can see the younger Futhark. We've got some missing ones here, but that goes down to the 16. And then this is the example of the Anglo-Saxon, where you have Gar here, which is an amazing rune. I really like that. We have these extra runes that we have here, and those are going up to 33, but I know I've seen even larger groupings of runes. And again, the reason why we're seeing these variations is because we're seeing the split of language, and the different languages then needing different, to denote different sounds in their language. So we have that. Again, we're talking about the oldest information that we have on how these runes would have been seen, how they would have been interpreted. The Oghams have the kennings that are there giving us the information. There are the main three ones that you'll see in books are the Old Icelandic, the Old Norwegian, and the Old English ones. The Icelandic and the Norwegian are almost identical. They don't have the same number, but of the ones that are there, the definition, they seem to have been taken from the same manuscript because they are almost identical. And some of them can be quite different than the Old English version of it. But the Old English rune poem is the oldest that we have. I believe that the manuscript that we have is around the 1200s, but we know that it was taken from a previous manuscript from the 8th or 9th century. So we're still talking, you know, the 700s, 800s here. And it has the most of the runes that are intact because it has the 24 Elder Futhark, and then it has 5 more of the newer ones from the language shift. So the Old English for me is sort of home base. And then I kind of take a look at the other two, which can sometimes have variances there. But because we have the Old English as being the oldest source and has the most of the runes, for me, that's kind of where I step into first for meanings. But it's fantastic that we have those, right? For something that is such an old system, we at least have a somewhat of an idea of how somebody would have seen those interpretations in the 700s. It's not taking it back to the 100s and prior to that, but at least takes us further back than we have of some other things. So I'm really thrilled that we have the access to those. This is an example of the Norwegian rune poem. This is 17th century, so the 1600s, but it's a copy of a 13th century manuscript. And then the Icelandic rune poem is in 4 different manuscripts that we have. The oldest of those would have been in the 1400s, and those were specific to the younger Futhark, so we don't have all of the letters in those because that was a smaller alphabet. It's really cool to see it written. And people today that do use runes to write with, again, there is some degree, depending on which one you're using, it's easiest to use the Old English because you have more sounds, letters to use. So you often see that being done in I think the Old English version of that. This is an important point to note as well. The actual names. So when we give names to the runes, we don't actually have, so when you see a manuscript that has sort of the shape of the rune right next to the rune poem, we actually don't have that for all of the runes. And so the names of the runes are often guesses of what they were called. We don't have them for all of them. And so we have people like, you know, Jackson, I keep messing the poor man's name up, Jackson Crawford. He even talks about that in some of his videos, that how we're pronouncing these runes and what we're even naming some of these runes are going to be very different. We don't know how these names and words sounded. People are making guesses. And so even with scholars, you are going to you're going to have variations because it's just somebody's guess as to how those particular things were made. And so, you know, again, figuring out where you land and then moving from there, I think is the important part of that. But it's so interesting for me. It's very interesting linguistically just to see this kind of shift and spread. All right, I'm going to stick my face over here. We're not going to talk much again. I think I've pre-talked about the idea of bind runes, and we talked about some of the different examples in the Harvest Mall of it being used in terms of magic. Again, most scholars, including Jackson Crawford, I know I've seen a video where he says, we don't know that it was ever used. They say there's no text. I'm like, it's right there in the Harvest Mall, which you read all of the time. So I think that's a little bit of sort of a scholastic distancing from things like magic and things of that nature that they don't want to talk about. But there are other things like, and I am not going to say this particular word, but one of the poems in the Poetic Edda talks about carving this specific. So the other ones will say kind of runes in general, but it actually talks about putting nowadays on your fingernail, carving it into your fingernail to help seduce women. And then again, other runes that would be useful for giving birth and things of that nature. So I think that that's more of a scholastic desire to step back. He does. I will definitely give some links. There's also an amazing, sorry, I should read what I'm saying for people coming back. Shiora is talking about the fact that Jackson Crawford has a great video on pronunciation. It's amazing. Most of the pronunciations that are on the cheat sheet are probably taken from that. There is also an amazing chant of the runes that we'll look at. I played it, put the video up for my last class, and so we'll probably play that next week. But there is a group that kind of sing chants through all of the runes, and it's really powerful. So we'll look at that. But his is fantastic. But he'll even say in some of his other ones, it's anybody. They do their best approximation, and I'm sure they do a really good job at it. But it is still to some degree guesswork on what it is. And I think that the scholastic, we understand. I think we know that the concept of magic was less separated, right, in the past than it is now. We have this concept of spirituality and magic and things of that over here. Even today, I battle against this with people. Like, our spiritual path and magic and all this stuff doesn't exist here, and we exist over here in our normal life. All around us is everything that we do is both our regular life and our magic life and our spiritual life. It's just life. And that's all around us, and energy informs and shapes us, and we can inform and shape energy all the time. It's all pulled together. And in the older days, and when cultures were much more of what I would say in that sort of people would say primitive, but more in that shamanic, really earth-based understanding of the world around them, this concept of magic and using things as magic wouldn't have been something that was thought twice about, right? It was just part and parcel to the way that people saw the world. And I think scholars today just kind of like to step back away from that in a way to just kind of preserve their integrity, their scholastic integrity. This is a reminder for myself to take a breath here, as well as you. I think we're pretty much done here in the slides. This whole set of classes, and again, any of my 4, even 6 weeks, if you take a 4 to 6 week class in college, it's insane, because you're trying to pack a lot of information and try to give a foundation in which to jump off of. So don't be stressed about any of this stuff. This is foundational information for you. You're not going to come, if you're totally new to runes, you're not going to come out of 4 weeks and be an expert rune master. However, you'll have some foundations, and these videos are going to be up as long as I'm around to go back and watch over and over again. And so don't stress about it. I just think it's important that we know where things are coming from, because it does help us to respectfully use and have a good solid platform to jump off of when we're working with the system. I do have a problem with just randomly taking a system, having no basis in it, and doing no degree of foundational work and just kind of running with it. I think that can be not just the best way to approach whatever system it is. And so that's why we put a lot of work into this. We are not going to spend a lot of time here. I just wanted to quickly do just a basic rundown of the Germanic worldview, which does really tie in with the tree, the world tree, the concept of the world tree, the concept of the 9 worlds and the 9 realms that we have. This is one person's example of the world tree. We try to, from the use of the manuscripts that we have, different people try to figure out exactly where all of the realms are placed. You're going to see variations on that because some of it is obviously being guesswork, but this is an example of the world tree and the different realms that are placed on it. And we will later do, I think there's fantastic reading to go into each of these worlds, using them as a spread piece there. So we'll talk a little bit more about it then. But it's important to understand that the Germanic worldview was seeing not a world that was just, here we are standing on Earth, with our 2 feet in the ground, right? And that's all there is. They had a much more fluid concept of different realms, different dimensions, crossing between those dimensions, relations with the different species in those different places, and the things that were created and came out of those different places. A much more fluid view, and I think an amazing, because I do believe that I do believe in different realities and different dimensions and things of that nature, and they had a much more fluid understanding of the world around them. Now, people can take this, and they do in a modern sense, and use these as more of a psychological, like these can be different psychological ways of thinking about what it means to be human in a psychological sense. And you can certainly do that. They did not think about these things as archetypal or psychologically based. These were, in their worldview, these were places and these were peoples that were peopled in these areas. And it was a beautiful and dynamic view of the world and the different dimensions that were there. So again, we're not going to spend a lot of time here because this is not a course on the Germanic worldview. But I think that the key to take away here, though, is that in terms of runic work, the understanding of the fluidity of what reality is and crossing into other dimensions, and back and forth, and the interchange of information and ideas and magic between these different realms is something that the people, the Celtic, the Germanic Celtic mindsets, which again, a lot of crossover, these weren't static things, there were intercrossings there. This is the way that they see the world, and working with runes, when you can step out of like a real rigid mindset, I think can tap into that in a beautiful way. So I just wanted to make sure that we talked about that. The other thing is the cycles within cycles. The 3 wells is a very common thing. So the number 3 and the number 9, this is part of the reason why I pull 3 or I cast 9 all the time, because these are powerful numbers, and 9 is 3 plus 3 plus 3. These are powerful numbers. But we do have the 3 wells. So the well of weird or fate, the well of memory and wisdom and inspiration, and then the cauldron that is sort of the source of everything. And all of these energies were interchanging and moving and flowing together. I love this. I'm a huge fan of the book called The Way of Weird. I had it up here, but I don't now. The Way of Weird by Brian Bates. He writes, but just as the worlds of gods Middle Earth and the dead are constantly replenished by the marrying of fire and frost, so also do they depend upon the balance and eternal cycle of night and day, winter and summer, woman and man, weak and strong, moon and sun, death and life. These forces and countless others form the endpoints of a gigantic web of fibers that cover all worlds. The web is the creation of the forces, and its threads, shimmering with power, pass through everything. It's a beautiful and dynamic world, and it's not static, and it's not just existing where our feet might be touching the ground. And this is the way of seeing the world that the concept of the runes being used as magic and as divination comes from. And I just think it's really powerful. I think we're pretty much done here. This is just an example where we get the poetic Edda. There's two Eddas. There's the poetic Edda and the prose Edda. The poetic Edda is the oldest. Again, I tend to stick, go as old as you can go. So this is a compilation of stories and poems and things of that nature. And this would be the oldest that we have. Snorri Sturluson, which was, I believe he is an Icelandic, but I could be wrong. I should have written that in there. He wrote the prose Edda, which is clearly just, again, pulling from these sources and kind of compiled them together. So those are the two oldest manuscripts we have. The poetic Edda being the oldest resource that we have for the Norse stories of the heroes and the gods that a lot of the runes came out of. This is the oldest source that we have in terms of those old stories, and it's amazing that we have this to be able to resource, and there's why I think everybody should have a good copy of this in English. In fact, let me see if I marked it. I should have, but I may not have. Okay, yeah, I'm going to read this real quick to you. We're going to have a pause and a reading space. Let me see what we have after this. All right, I just keep going, don't I? Just keep going. Just don't hate me, people. Don't hate me. I'm going to read this really quick because this is really important, because this is the story of how the runes came into being. So I'm starting kind of in the middle of things. If you have a copy of the Poetic Edda, I'm starting with line 138. I know that I hung on a wind-battered tree 9 long nights, pierced by a spear and given to Odin, myself to myself, on that tree whose roots grow in a place no one has ever seen. No one gave me food, no one gave me drink. At the end, I peered down, I took the runes, screaming I took them, and then I fell. I learned 9 spells from the famous son of Boltthorn and the father of Bestla, and I won a drink of that precious mead poured from Orthrur. My imagination expanded. I became wise, I grew, and I thrived. One word chased another word flowing from my mouth. One deed chased another deed flowing from my hands. You will find runes, runic letters to read, very great runes, very powerful runes, which Odin painted, and which the holy gods made, and which Odin carved. Odin carved for the gods, and Dane for the elves, Davlin for the dwarves, and Aswith for the giants. I carved some myself. And this is one of the pieces here I love, because this is talking about the runes. Do you know how to write them? Do you know how to read them? Do you know how to paint them? Do you know how to test them? Do you know how to ask them? Do you know how to bless them? Do you know how to send them? And do you know how to offer them? We can see from that poem, we're talking about using the runes to write, to read, to paint with, to test, to ask questions of them, to use them in blessings, to send them, to receive them. This is energy work, right? They're using the runes themselves for the exchanging of energy as well as the exchanging of information and using them as an alphabet, which I think is so amazing. So this is what we have of the sort of origins of the runes, and understanding again that they were seen as something far more than just an alphabet used to read or write. What you see over here on the right, and I'm gonna escape out of this even if I still have more slides because who knows what time it is. This is actually, you can find all of the Elder Futhark runes within this. So it's kind of, you'll see this in different formats. Sometimes it's a little bit longer and skinnier without kind of going wide like this. But it has all the different shapes of the runes in it. And so the concept of weird is the other concept that I think that's important to know when working with runes, especially when you're thinking about the old rune poems and how they saw, we translate weird, well, now we translate it as something that's strange or something that's weird. We'll say, oh, that's weird. But the term weird is actually used to mean something more about fate. And we use that to think that of a more rigid idea of fate and destiny. And we do see some of that, right? But I love the fact that the actual root word is a feminine noun, and it is one of the names of the three Norns, but it is what is in the process of happening. It's not like a fixed thing that's over here, but we're eternally in the process of creating our fate. There's a much more fluid understanding of fate, just as there is some things in which we have escape and inescapable fate, like Ragnarok. But in the Old English, that talks about fate in Beowulf, which I spelled incorrectly. Fate remains wholly inexorable. It doesn't move. Fate goes ever as she shall. We don't have a way out of our fate. So there are concepts in the older text of this idea of fate as something that we can't escape, but it is also seen as being something that is fluid, which I think is really, it's just interesting to see that. But I think a lot of people, it fascinates me that we wouldn't think runes were real. I know. It is interesting. I think that, should we have all the slides? No, I don't put all of the slides. Maybe I should. I try not to bombard people. I only put sort of key information in there. Sometimes if it's other information that I'm taking from other sources, as a teacher, I can put it in slides, but I can't necessarily hand it out as something that people have. So some of it is because of where I'm sourcing things from. And then some of it is just trying to give you key helpful information because you can rewatch and take notes of other things. Shay needs coffee. She's like gonna have some caffeine here. But yeah, it is interesting to me, Kat, that, but again, I think that's more when you're looking at the academic side of things. I think that they try very much, if let's say you're an academic who does study Old Norse, which is full of all these mythology, or if you're studying mythology, I think they need some degree of a structure of this is authentic, degree of scholastic integrity involved in it, I guess. I'm not sure, because to me it's kind of funny to think of the concept that especially in these times and cultures in which there's just no separation between the two, I think is it's kind of funny. It's interesting, but it is the case. You'll see a lot of people, if you do enough research on runes and Old Norse and things like that, you'll see a lot of people that quickly say, you know, I'm not talking about divination. You know, I'm not talking about magic-y stuff here. I'm talking about scholarly things here. They're having to really kind of define that this is not that. They kind of put the use of divination of runes and stuff as a new age thing. Versus a very old age, a very, very old age thing. So I think that's enough. I think that's enough. I think this is it. No, look at, there's more. I'm sorry, folks. I'm sorry. The concept of weird is something that is really important to me. it's really fascinating. I use this all the time, this quote here. In its archaic and original sense, it meant that aspect of life that was so deep, so all pervasive, and so central to our understanding of ourselves and our world that it was inexpressible. Weird refers to our personal destiny. It connects us to all things, thoughts, emotions, and events in the cosmos as if through the threads of an enormous, invisible, but dynamic web. That explains how I see the world functioning to a T. Weird existed before the gods and will exist after them, yet weird lasts only for an instant because it is the constant creation of forces. Weird is itself constant change, like the seasons, yet because it is created at every instant, it is unchanging, like a still center of a whirlpool. All we can see are the ripples dancing on the top of water. And last quote, the pattern of weird is like the grain in wood or the flow of a stream. It is never repeated in exactly the same way. But the threads of weird pass through all things, and we can open ourselves to its pattern by observing the ripples as it passes by. So it is that amazing understanding of fate as being something that's ever changing, but unchangeable in that moment that you're in that moment, right? If we're living moment to moment, our fate in that moment is unchangeable. But across our lifetime, our fates are fluid and ever moving and shifting and changing. And so we're not locked into fate except for in that very moment that we're living in. I'm dying to do a Way of Weird book reading, like book club with people, because it's amazing. It's based on an old manuscript. Now the Brian Bates novelized it so that it is a story. It's an amazing story that's there, but it's based on a manuscript that they found, and that has, you know, magic and remedies and rituals and things from you know, from I do. We'll do it in the, we can do it in the Rune Club, or in the Room Club, in the Room Facebook group. Whoever wants to play along, we can play along, because I've been dying to do it, but it's hard to get people to geek out over. It's hard to get people, other than a few people, to geek out over the Way of Weird. You can get it, I think, in Kindle format. You can also get it in paper format. Now, you used to be able to for a while. I had it back in the early 90s, and then I had a rabbit eat it some 10, 15, 20 years ago, and I couldn't get a hold of it again, and it came back into print a few years ago, and I was so excited because it was one of those books that really helped to define the way in which I see the world working. Is really powerful. It has nothing to do with runes, but it does in terms of the mindset and the ways in which understanding the way that medicine, magic, fate, destiny, divination of, you know, seeing a flock of birds shifting, have divinatory purposes. The divination was much broader, right, than a specific set of cards or even a specific set of runes, but is all around us if we open ourselves up to it. And so it really speaks to those understanding that once we can take our divination, which we all love and we work with, but once we can even step further back into where it's just out in the world and it's all around us, it just opens up this amazing way of gaining information and messages that's just powerful. Anyways, again, because I love weird, we're gonna wrap it up here. A way of being that transcends our conventional notions of free will and determinism. All aspects of the world were seen as being in constant flux and motion between the psychological and mystical polarities of fire and frost. And this is really a part of the mind. This concept of the polarities of fire and frost is woven through the mindset of these timeframes and these peoples. A creative organic vision paralleling the classical Eastern concepts of yin and yang and echoed by recent developments in theoretical physics, in which the world is conceived as relationships and patterns. Following from the concept of weird was a vision of the universe from the gods to the underworld as being connected by an enormous all-reaching system of fibers, rather like a three-dimensional spider's web. Everything was connected by strands of fiber to the all-encompassing web. At any event, anywhere, resulted in reverberations and repercussions throughout the web. And this is so important because there are certain systems, such as, again, I Ching. You'll see this in I Ching. You'll see this in the Hebrew alphabet. You'll see this in Oghams, and you certainly see this in runes, where these weren't seen as these just like little symbols only, but they actually represent energetic flux. So that when you cast runes, you're seeing a reaction of the actual energies that are around you. When you shift those, same thing with geomancy, you can actually shift geomancy figures, and you're causing not just a visual change, but you're enacting energetic change in the world around you, which is really powerful. It goes beyond just a tool of divination, but you're actually doing energy work when you are casting. And a lot of casting systems are this way. This is what my tokens were based on, that understanding that we're not just getting information, but we're actually enacting change. The act of doing any kind of divination, doing a tarot reading, you already started to change the scope of, so let's say you ask a question about, a job or something like that. The very act of casting that reading is affecting change. It's affecting change in your mind, which is going to affect change in the choices you make, which is going to affect change in your actual physical world. So divination becomes, in these types of systems, when we can really sink into them, it becomes something that is far more than just information gathering. And it's actually energy. It's working with energy. And that's something that it just, in my opinion, was just the way that these people in this time frame saw the world, before science, in the way that we see science, started to separate away. Science, religion, magic, these things started to separate away, in a way that I think does a bit of disservice to the fact that science doesn't negate magic and magic doesn't negate science. It's just expressions of the same things. But we're now going to be rambling even further off on Kelly's soapbox, because I love runes. Do we not love these things? We do. We already talked about homework, so I'm not going to go into this, but just take some time. If you've read runes for a long time, step kind of back from whatever meanings that you might have locked in. If you've never read runes before, just think about the words. I'm going to send a link of this chanting of the runes because it's so powerful. But here, think about the sound that the letter makes. Think about the name of the rune. Think about the meaning of that word and these runic poems, and taking all that, come up with a couple keywords for yourself of what that associates. It's just trying to sort of hone you in on these particular symbols, and start to develop your own particular relationship with those. So we're not going to, I mean, if you already cast runes, go ahead and cast runes. But if you're new, we're not going to be, casting runes this week, but it's more spending time. If you have a set of runes, and we're going to talk about that in a second because a couple people asked questions. But if you have a set of runes, take that rune out. So if you've got, even if you have a card deck. Now I say I don't use card decks, and I don't, it doesn't mean you can't have one. So if you do have a deck, pull out, this was can we talk about this, I can't believe I pulled this one. So this is Naudes, which is the rune for need, is what it is defined as. When I was doing my year ahead, I pull a rune for each of the months as well as a card. And so I was pulling a rune for the year, and I pulled this and I put it back. I I confess, I just put it back. I said, no, I don't. I have enough need, and no, I don't want this room. So I put it, I had come off of a harder year. I normally, of course, I'm pulling in my year ahead in December, which is the month that my son passed away. So it's already a rough month, right? And so I'm like, no, I literally stuck it back in the pile, which is not something I generally do. And I stuck it back into the pile, shook them all up. I'm like, no, I'm getting a different one. Pulled it again, came out again. Just to be fabulous and do that to myself. And it's been the best thing ever. And it's, of course, they come up for a reason. It doesn't mean that my year was full of need, but it was really sinking into the energy of that. Anyways, that's a side thing, because that's the one I pulled to show you. But take the rune out that you're working with. Look at, to take this list out and say, okay, this is there's in Fehu here. You can see the first line. Pull Fehu out. This the F sound is in fee. Actually, one of our the word fee derives from the name of this, right? How do you pronounce it? Fehu. That's how I pronounce it. You do you. You do you, boo, right? It means cattle, or it can mean wealth. Here's the Old English. Wealth provides comfort, but you must share it. Who hopes to cast lots for judgment before the gods? Money causes strife among kin. The wolf grows up in the woods. Money causes strife among kin, and the fire of the flood tide and the path of the serpent. So we have this concept of wealth being a comfort, but you have to share it. Like it shouldn't stay static within you, but be careful amongst your kin, right? We still have that concept of money, and don't mix money and family, right? We hear that all the time, like don't lend money to family, or money causes a lot of problems in families, right? We have that. This is all the way back that I understood this. Families were no different back in this time. Kind of think these things through, and then give yourself a couple keywords that you might get out of that. I don't know why I'm still holding that one up there. So that's your homework for this week. And I think finally we've come to the end of the slides. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I should have looked through. I might have trimmed some out if I had looked at it again. Okay, let me stop sharing here so I can see who's sleeping. I know, but we're not done. We're not done. I wanted to quickly, people had questions about runes. So I want to quickly go through those. Okay, stop sharing. Oh, Chris, I think he might have been sleeping. I saw him. He's rubbing his face saying, oh, he's rubbing coffee on his face. He said, give me some more caffeine. I do that sometimes when I get a room. I don't like, I think that's more magic. I know I truthfully am not a person to put things back, because I really do find light and shadow in all of them. But it's just in that moment, it's like, no, I'm not going to take that one. I don't want it. Take it back. And nope, it was not going to be taken back. Runes are very, very precise, and can be, all things can be, but I feel like runes definitely. Okay, I'm going to, let's see if we can do this without me messing with, that's true. Then I wouldn't have a chance. That's smart. See, something else would happen, Chris. You can't fool the universe. It would just come up with something else terrible to say. No, nice try, folks. Nice try. I'm going to try this. I really wish they hadn't taken me being able to put hold, but let me, so I'm going to try to do this. You can stand up and stretch, but we're not doing too horrible. Actually, this is better than I thought I was going to be time-wise. Okay, let me try to pull up my phone, because it's just going to be easier for you to see the runes. I think there's a video up of options for runes and things like that, but I figured I'd still address it. So let me, and you do not, I have a lot of runes. I love runes. I've been using runes since the mid-90s, so I love them. So you do not need this many runes. You don't need this many tarot decks. You don't need this many, and you don't even need to buy a set. Runes are really easy to make a set. And in fact, runes and oghams are one of those traditions in which making your own set is kind of part of the tradition of really kind of picking out the wood that's going to be good for you, or you're wanting, using a wood burner or a freaking marker. Like, it really doesn't take much to create a set of runes for yourself. So it's one of those wonderful things that you can spend almost zero to a lot of money, depending on what you like to use. Okay, let me find this Rune Quest Week 1 because I can click the link. All right. Now we might get some sound feedback before. Unable to use, we don't want you to use the microphone. And I don't want you to use any audio because that causes feedback. All right, so I'm going to flip this around. I'm going to flip. Oh, here we go. Start video. So if you get nauseous, don't look at this window for a minute because I'm going to have to wiggle it around a bit. And I have to make it larger because I can't see. I can't see it, so I'm going to spotlight it. There we go. So look away if you're someone who gets nauseous, as I am. I get car sick really easy. And watching, even for myself to watch this, makes me nauseous. All right, we're just gonna be wonky today because we're just looking at runes. I'll have to be better about it. Let me clear some stuff out of here. So the first question, or one of the questions I get a lot, is about what to cast runes onto. And we will start casting, you've got this week to kind of figure out what you want to do. Again, if you're new, some people have been doing this a while and have a whole bunch like I do, but some people don't. You don't need anything, okay? You can cast on a very messy wood table. I highly recommend, if you're new to casting, these are super cheap options. Something with a little lip like this is really helpful in casting because they tend to be, in my experience, they tend to be very energetic. And so depending on the weight of your set, depending on how vigorous you cast, and we will talk next week about some casting techniques because there are techniques to casting that cause a nice movement of the things versus them all just plopped in the middle and or them all like flying off the thing. All of this is, let me see if this will still come up. I think it will. Yeah, all this is something from, I think this one was from Joanne Fabrics. You can go just about anywhere and get these little like signs and pictures, and they're inset, so that makes a lip that's right here, which I find very helpful. The fairies and the fae stole my other casting tray for like a year, and I could not find it, so I had to come up with something, and I loved it so much. But this was cheap because I use a coupon for everything. I probably paid under $5 for this. It's just a cheap thing. I stuck some, I used 3 pieces of scrapbook paper and just glued them in there. And there you go. You've got a nice cast. I use this all the time. I absolutely love it. When you're, casting, it's going to stop things from going and flying everywhere. And that can be really helpful to people who are new to casting and kind of a little too enthusiastic. But again, we're going to talk about actual casting next week. But something like this is really helpful and really cheap. This is another one. If you go to a place that like Joann's or Hobby Lobby or Michael's, these are US, I don't know outside of the US, different places. This is actually a frame that's made to put scrapbook paper in, like make a collage, I suppose, and hang it on your wall. But what I like is that it fits scrapbook paper perfectly. So you can have, different types of scrapbooks that you want to put on there. I've seen people actually use maps like of their area for pendulum work and or casting over areas with maps, which is pretty cool. But it just comes like that. But it is nice because it holds a piece of scrapbook paper, because then you can take something, say, like this, and just put a big X in it to denote the 4 elements, so that the area, this is how I generally cast. I'll show you how I cast. But you can, just draw a big X right here and you're done. Or you can draw a series of circles here to give yourself different areas to almost like spreads. Positions almost like, which I'll show you in a second. But that's one of the nice things about picking up something like this, is again, got the low lip, and it lets you kind of modify. I've seen people break one of these down into a grand tableau so that you can cast them onto that, and the runes fall into the houses. And it could be different houses that you choose, the months of the year where you can cast onto a calendar. There's a lot of different things that you can play around with. And it's really cheap because it's just a piece of scrapbook paper. So that's something that you can cast on. One of the things that I love, and somebody on Etsy sells this for an insane amount of money, when you can literally, they just take a piece of square fabric, which you can go get, I think they're called fat quarters on. They're very cheap. You can just get this little, I use them for quilting. And then cut a circle of fabric and sew that circle of fabric onto the square fabric. Makes a wonderful casting surface and costs hardly anything. DIY in these types of things are abound. Now this is very wrinkly because it was stuffed under things I haven't been using it. But this is an amazing rune cloth that I really like. My problem with this, and I still do sometimes use it, it's a little bit busy for me, but it's gorgeous. It has the runes that are around it. It has all of the 9 realms, which is really great. When I do a 9 realm reading, I do like to have this because I can actually cast onto the 9 realms. You can go on Etsy and find all kinds of different rune cloths. So something like that you can get, again, from any price, from nothing that you do yourself to really expensive. This is a version, I don't use this one because I use the plain one. I don't like the modeling as much, but this was so the guy that made this saw my review of this and said, if you had a perfect casting cloth, what would it look like? I'll make it for you. And this is my version. And again, you can draw this super easy on a piece of paper because it's just circles. So this is my version of a perfect, I use this for runes, I use it for oghams, I use it for charms, I use it for my own journey tokens, because it has what I need, which is the 4 elements, because I like to see what element the different runes or whatever I'm casting go into. It has the inner to outer circles. It also has where it can break up into sets of 3, where this is the third, this is the third, and this is the third. And that's it. It has the directions on it as well. Again, you can draw 3 circles and lines through it on a piece of paper. They're very simple to create some sort of casting surface, or none at all, and just cast blank. And we're going to talk, again, we're going to do casting. So we're going to be doing a lot of, I think the best way to work with systems is to actually see us working with systems. So we'll do a lot of that in the next couple weeks. But in terms of casting, that's it. You can do it on a table. You can sit on the floor on a blanket and cast things. You don't really need anything more than a surface. Again, depending on the types of surfaces is how far things are going to fly. It has to do with the weight. This is my actual very first, I don't use this anymore because I can't read it, but this was my first from the 90s set of runes that I ever had. And some of the gold makes my eyesight is bad, and so I have a hard time reading them now. But this is heavier, right? Because you can get a lot of stone sets and they aren't going to move as much. If you have a really slick surface, they could go ice skating off as well, versus some lighter weight things. So it really comes down to your runes and then the surface that you're going to be putting it on. Some people like to use like a velvety feeling because it does have a little bit of nap. I think that's the word for that, but I'm not a fabric person. That kind of keeps it from skating around. I like for things that I cast to be able to move a bit, because you want them to spread, right? You don't want them to just clump in the middle of something, but then you just don't want them to go where they're all up here and they never just kind of spread out. So play around with that with your own set, and that's going to help you. But don't feel like it doesn't have to cost much. In terms of runes, again, that was my very first set. What do I got in here? This is the rune set I'm currently using. I had a student send me this set in one of my rune classes. This is a Northumbrian rune set. Actually, Gars should be in there. They had 2 Gars. I don't know why. But these come, you know, like wood cut out so that you can put them back in. That's a lot of work casting. I just keep this out all the time. So, but they're beautiful. I don't want to take the time to put them all back in there with the one I'm using. So that's currently the one I'm using because I've been working with the Anglo-Saxon or the Northumbrian rune set currently. So that's the one I'm currently using. You can pick these up on a couple of different like Etsy shops. This is a Elder Futhark set in the same format, and this is actually an Icelandic. If we look at this, there's some really interesting ones in the, look at that one. I had to look this up. I was like, what exactly is this? But this is an Icelandic set. So there's some different, I've never personally worked with a set like this. I don't even know all of the sounds. I believe, and they're not what you would think, like that's not a K sound. So you can't go by exactly how you would use it. But I thought that was an interesting one just because you don't see these Icelandic ones very often. So that's those. I have a set, this is one, I do really like this one. This is a set of obsidian ones with the gold, because the black and the gold stand out really nice. These cast really well. I do actually like these. And those cast nicely. These are cheap. I mean, you can get a set of crystal ones for $10, I would say, between $10 and $15. You can get crystal ones pretty cheaply. I'm pretty sure you can even get them on Amazon. This is one of my favorite sets from Etsy, but the problem is they're on cedar wood, and cedar is super light, and it literally, they feel like cardboard. There's no heft to them, and I've just found, maybe because I, for years, used this set, that I just find that I like a little bit of weight in the hand and in casting. So they're my favorite ones just because I picked them out with the world tree on the back. They're so beautiful, but I don't use them much because they're just too light. This is from a low scarabeo set. You can get a set of runes with a book that you can get. You can also get kind of a clay set that comes with the book by Ralph Bloom. You can still get those at Barnes and Nobles. I see those in Barnes and Nobles all the time. The book, I wouldn't do much with the book other than it's great history, but he does change a lot of things in his runes. So there's tons of rune sets. If you don't have a rune set, you can also go, I have a set somewhere and I didn't bring it out. You can go to a craft store and go to the wood section, and you can get little sets of discs for hardly anything, and literally just use a marker, write the, draw the rune on it. You can even write the keyword of what it means on the top of it and use that as a learning set. That's a very cheap way to kind of work with the runes a while before and maybe looking for that ultimate set that is like your favorite set that you want to purchase. So if you don't have a set of runes this week, you're going to want a set of runes for next week. So that can be just getting some wood out of your yard if you're handy with wood. Getting a branch and cutting it into the little round wood things is something that, and carving your own in there with a wood burner. I see a lot of times people will use a wood burner. I wouldn't use a knife because I would cut my finger off, but you might be less prone to accidents than I am. You can make a set that way. So yeah, there's options that are really, really cheap. And then there's options that are less cheap. I think the most expensive, these, I want to say these are probably about $30, $25 maybe, something like that. Most of the stone sets are $10 to $15 that you can get. I have no clue what I paid for this because that was in the 90s and who knows. And again, I don't have decks really to show you. I know there's a beautiful set out right now with watercolor paintings of crystals and flowers associated with them that I'll probably end up getting at some point. But this is I use this a lot. Again, more for setting out. So if I, take if Sawillo is my, or Sawillo, however you want to say it, if that's like my card for the month, that's the one thing I do like about cards is if I have a particular card that a symbol I'm working with, you can set that out. You can set it out on your altar. You can set it out up where you can see it all the time and you're reminded to work with it. So this set is also good for that. I use this a lot because it can actually stand up on shelving that I use. And it's flat, they're all shaped the same, so I can set a set of those out into a workspace. The fourth class, we will talk a little bit more about using runes in more of a sense of doing workings with it, kind of using the energy of them versus using them for divination. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. But having a couple sets are nice just for that. I do tend to have this set tends to stay in a working space if I want to pull things. This stays on my main thing for setting cards, a symbol out and keeping it out, versus this set being one that I cast with right now. So, I'm always a proponent for multiple of things, but you don't need them. So yes, Shay, I would say you can definitely use you can set them out for altar work. Having a sand pit where I have a sand where I put in stones to make the shape of geomancy symbols for working. So you can do similar things like that with runes also. But again, we'll talk about that more in the last class. But if you don't have one, figure that out this week so that you do have a set to cast for next week, because we'll be doing more casting. Oh, those pretty, yes, I could definitely, because those are flat too. So because I love them, but I don't tend to find myself using them. But they definitely can get used. But I can also just collect them because I am a collector, clearly. Okay, I think that's casting cloths. Again, do it yourself. Don't use anything. Sit on a blanket. Sit out in the grass and throw them. It's a little harder because they're going to stick. They don't move as much. But on a picnic blanket, you really don't need anything much. Visit a local craft store. You'll come up with a lot of ideas. You can find remnants of cloth, thicker cloth that's going to hold up well. Just cut it in a square and be done with it. Size-wise, I will say that I love casting cloths to be about 18 inches. For some reason, that tends to be the maximum size that in terms of space. If it gets more than that, it gets a bit much. But I love this. This one is a 12 by 12. Well, it's probably a little bit more, but the inside is 12 by 12 because that's a piece of scrapbook paper, and that works really well. Now, because most runes aren't really big, you can get some bigger sets, but most runes are fairly small. And so, all of them I think would be fine on a 12 by 12. So look at fabric stores, and then again, in terms of runes, either get on Amazon and get yourself a gem set that's going to be pretty cheap, or go into the wood section and draw some on there, and you're going to be set to go, just so that you have something to cast. Because especially if you only have decks, we really are not going to be working with decks. We're going to be working with casting, because that is, in my opinion, their best use is through casting. So that will be a part of your homework this week, as well as working through that worksheet. I put a link on the email. Let's see, I guess we can stop looking at my hands if I could find my mouse. There's a link on the webpage that has everything now that you can join. I saw a couple people did, so I know that it works. But if you are on Facebook, and I know many people do not like Facebook, I'm not a huge fan of Facebook myself, but trying to figure out how to get this, but I've tried a bunch of different options, and it's just the easiest one. Spotlight video. But there is on that link to all of the information, I put an actual button that you can click to join the Facebook group that way, if you're interested in doing so. The name of this rune deck is Cosmic Whisper. Yeah, Cosmic Whisper. It's not from the US. I want to say maybe it's in it all in English. I didn't purchase it, so I know that there are some shops, because my friend Patrick, who bought his set and then he bought a set for me, bought it from a shop in the US because it was cheaper shipping than to come to the United States from Europe. So I do know there are some shops in the US who carry it. But I don't know what the actual country, so it's 70 US. Yeah, it's not cheap. And I don't blame them. Like, this is just one of those things. It's so time intensive. It's gorgeous. It's just one of those. Happy birthday. I am happy to have you. And I think the quality is definitely reflected in the deck itself, but you don't have to have it to enjoy your runes. Thank you very much. Okay, does anybody have any, we can have a show and tell, especially next week, if everybody kind of gets together what they're going to be using. It would be great to see what people, and I'll also have, I don't know where I stuck them. I have stuff everywhere, because, and I might have, if I can find the video, I will put it up. So here's an example. This is OMs, but here's an example of, you can get these like little wood things at craft stores, right? So here's a set of OMs. I have the same thing with runes, I just can't find it. But for example, you could put the rune in the middle. Then in this case, I have the willow and then the Gaelic name at the top here, but you could literally put the name of the rune, and you could put the keyword that's on that cheat sheet, your keyword there, so that if you're completely new to runes and you're like, well, what in the heck, is that a blank rune? No, it's Hagelas. I'm going to get this and say, what is that? Like, what am I supposed to do with that? It's not an image. A lot of us are coming from tarot, where we might have images to cue us into what something means, where sometimes when you're new to a system, if you look at it and you're like, what am I supposed to do with that? Like, what is that telling me? There's nothing wrong with making yourself a set that has some keywords to kind of tie you in and cue you into what you're doing in the reading, so that you're in the moment of the reading, you can focus on reading versus memorization, which you're going to get to. It's not that many, you'll get there. So that's something that you can do really cheaply. They have these. They also have little round ones. They even have rough wood cut. I know Hobby Lobby has, again, US, but they have like little wood discs that are literally cut off branches, and they still have the bark on them. Those are gorgeous. And you can just either use, and then I just put a little stamp on the back of it just with some little branches, and you can make a little set. This literally costs under $5 to make this. And so that is something that will get you going and help you learn. And that's the point. The point of this class is getting in there and having something to use, because you're going to get the most use out of stuff if you're actually getting down and dirty and throwing those runes on the table. So, all right, I'm going to let you guys go and let you can have a big sigh of relief. I would not suggest printing second week's stuff is up there so that you could print. My recommendation is to wait for me to email you, because I do want to add there's a couple of things I want to add into that. I definitely want to add a couple of the extra letters, just because they're ones that I'm working with, and that way you have them if you want to work with the Anglo-Saxon runes or the Northumbrian runes. You'll see them in both ways. So hold off a couple days. I probably won't get to that till Monday, but I'll email you when it's okay to print that, just to save you from having to reprint. I mean, you can always print the extra pages, but then if you're like me, the page numberings being off would probably bug me, but that's up to you guys. So there we go. I will send you by tomorrow. It probably will not be up tonight because I have to leave from here and do some family things and go to a haunted house. So it probably will not, and it has to process. When it downloads, it has to process. So tomorrow, the final video will get put up, and I'll send you a link with the links of all the books and things like that that I mentioned in the chat. And then again, I'm going to start today in the chat group, on the Facebook group, of doing a pull every day. Just, I can sometimes help to see how does somebody interpret something daily. I think it's helpful. So if anybody else who's in the group wants, and as I know, like Chris, I know uses runes already. So if he wants to put pulls on there, feel free to put pulls in there, and because that's what I'm going to do through the rest of the class is put some daily rune pulls there. So no, I know, no touching in the haunted house. Yeah, I'm hoping I'm not grabbed because I will pee my pants for sure. So we will hope not. All right, I'm gonna go. I will see you guys all next week. We'll be talking about the runes next week. So we'll be going through each of the runes individually and doing some casting. So we're just gonna get them on the table and start casting with them next week. So that's what we'll be doing. And I'm gonna, when I hit end meeting to stop this, you're all gonna be kicked out. So see you later.